Welcome to Organizational Behavior. This is week 8. I'm your online instructor, Diana Block. And this is the week that you're going to do your movie analysis paper. So I look forward to this because I know that you've got some great summaries of the organizational behavior in those films that we selected that you're going to go over this week. So, we do have some reading as well. So, we're going to talk about the reading for this week and how this can help you tie into your organizational behavior paper over the movie. So, when we look at chapters 15 and 16 this week, we're going to be talking about designing an effective organization and organizational structure, which the films that we pre-selected for you to write the paper over have as a background an organization. And so one of the things that will be easy for you to look at is the actual structure of this organization and how it relates to the organizational behavior topics that we have discussed in class and in the reading. So I want to direct you to the systems model of organizational processes. And this is on page 406, where it breaks down the model of constraints, organizational design variables, and design outcomes that actually lead to the systems model of organizational processes. So if you look through 406, on page 406, you're going to see the throughputs in the model are the 5 design variables. Now, these design variables are the characteristics. There we go. These design variables are the characteristics that managers are able to manipulate so that they can achieve the organizational outcomes that they want. So on page 406, and it continues to 407, you see here the 5 characteristics that managers are able to manipulate to achieve a specific organizational outcome structure. And the first one is decision making. And so we're going to talk about decision making and how that relates to the organizational design and the structure. And then the third one is the control and motivation, and then the work design, and finally the organizational culture. These are the 5 items that are the characteristics that managers manipulate to achieve organizational outcomes. And as you're reviewing your movie paper, you should see some or all of these that are displayed in the organization that you are examining in that film. So let's take a look first at decision making. Now, if you recall, decision making, it says here is that first characteristic in chapter 15 that managers manipulate to achieve organizational structure design. And you'll remember that in chapter 3, we talked a lot about decision making. So when you get into decision making and how decision making is done in the organization in your film, if decision making is one of the topics you choose to focus on, you're going to have a lot of information as far as concepts that you could write about. If you'll recall back in chapter 3, we talked about whether decision making is centralized or decentralized. That's actually in chapter 15, whether it's centralized or decentralized, which means does decision making come from higher levels of the organization or lower levels. Some of the things in chapter 3 about decision making had to do with how many people are involved in the process of the decision making process. On page 78, you'll see where they discuss autocratic alternatives, consultative solutions, and group alternatives. And those all relate to the people and how many people are involved in the decision making. In that same chapter 3, you also talked about formal and informal reasoning, convergent thinking, divergent thinking, the decision-making styles, analytical, directive, behavioral, conceptual. So when you talk about how are decisions made in this film, in the organization in the film, these are some of the items that you will probably want to discuss. Some of the specific concepts and terminology from the text that you will want to discuss. So the next thing on page 406 The next characteristic it discusses is structure. So, under structure, we're talking about the hierarchy and the span of control. So, the hierarchy being flat or steep relates to the span of control of the management. So, a very steep hierarchy creates a situation of formal power. And power, you discussed back in chapter 13, is where we discuss types of power, power tactics, hierarchy, and formal power. So, hierarchy is um, the fact that power is being held disproportionately. Some people have more than others. That is the concept of hierarchy. So, in the firm that you're analyzing in the movie, what's the hierarchy? What's the span of control? What are the power types and power tactics that are present in that firm? That's another concept specific terminology usage that you can apply towards the film that that you're not reviewing, but you're writing about organizational behavior in. The next characteristic of organizational design is control and motivation. And control and motivation, specifically, we talked about in chapter 4. And some of the concepts that we discuss in chapter 4 have to do with the intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. So we remember that intrinsic motivation comes from the beliefs and values of the actual employee, and the extrinsic motivators are things that the company does to motivate. um, so we talked about locus of control as far as the employee's belief, their intrinsic motivator, the extent to which they control their environment and their success. We talked about the needs hierarchy, and then with extrinsic motivators, we're looking at rewards and punishment and behavior modification and various other concepts that we discussed in chapter 4. So when you're writing about the organization in the movie, you want to focus on not just in general whether or not people are motivated, but why. What are the specific concepts and theories from chapter 4 that relate to the motivation that you're seeing taking place in the film? Then, as we look at the fourth characteristic, which is work design, remember back in chapter 5, along with motivation, we also talked about job characteristics. We looked at the 5 core job characteristics of the Hackman model and how they relate to specific outcomes like effectiveness and motivation. And so those characteristics were skill identity, skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback from the job. That was reviewed on page 132, where we looked at the design of a job that will motivate people. In that same chapter, we talked about things like job rotations, job enrichment, person job fit. So, if any of that applies to the organization that you're uh, viewing in the film, you can look at how the work design relates to their level of job motivation and job satisfaction. The last characteristic of the organizational design is the organizational culture. And one thing that I thought it would be good for you to include in the analysis of the films you're looking at under culture is what type of conflicts are present. In each of the films that are pre-selected, there is some type of central conflict that is happening that's part of the culture of the organization. And in chapter 14, we discuss conflict and the types of conflict, whether that be relationship conflict, task conflict, or process conflict. We also looked at whether those conflicts are constructive or destructive, and we looked at some structural interventions on page 375, how to handle conflicts. So those are some places that you could start when you're looking at what you should write about for your movie analysis papers. Again, remember we want to use specific concepts, specific terminology and theory from the chapter that demonstrate that you have studied organizational behavior. We don't want just a general overview of the movie and what happened in it. I want you to demonstrate that you have learned about organizational behavior and I can identify specific theories and concepts when they're presented on the screen related to organizational behavior. There's also discussion this week, so don't forget about that. The discussion this week talks about how you might reorganize a large retailer. So you want to focus on chapters 15 and 16 when you're attempting to complete the discussion assignment for this week. I look forward to reading your papers. I'm sure they're going to be great. If you have any questions or concerns, be sure to contact me this week using the Blackboard IM or email, whichever is more convenient for you. And I wish you a great week.